Hello, everybody. This is Trip, and we are. I'm in Los Angeles, and Jake, where are you today? You in South Carolina?
I'm in South Kakalaki.
Ooh, man. Next week, maybe we should do it when you drive through Raleigh.
Ooh, that'd be fun.
Then we could be
Yeah.
in person.
Yeah.
Um,
Let's talk
I'm
about
here
that.
doing the Process Summer Institute, so it's a 1 week class on. Um, Catherine Keller's teaching a class, Donna Bowman's teaching a class, and then me, and mine's on process and Christology stuff. But yeah, my hotel's about a mile from campus, and today it is significantly hotter than yesterday. So I've already started sweating walking over here. That's why I'm glistening. You are not glistening, Jake.
No, I'm very cool because in South Carolina it's hot all the time, and so we keep the AC very cool all the time. It's one thing that we do well down here. One of the one of the few things. So that and grits.
Oh yeah, I support grits. All
Hmm.
right, so you've organized a lot of the comments and stuff into topics. There are
Hmm.
two emails we can do after that
Cool.
not connected to the topics you already mentioned. Um, so yeah, let's go ahead and jump in because uh, otherwise it might turn into like a homebrew level intro. And
Yeah, let's not do that. So yeah, I've got five basic areas here. They all kind of interrelate. Um, should we list them all out and then go in, or just go
no,
one by
like
one?
preserve
Just
the
go one by
mystery.
one. Okay,
Yeah,
all right.
preserve the mystery.
Um, so the first question, uh, there was a bunch of questions, and I tried to group them all into general questions. And the first area is, how does Tillich relate to deconstruction? And with regard to deconstruction, are we participating in deconstruction? Are we tearing down idols of our own volition, or are we watching this process happen? And I think that's a really good question, especially considering who's doing the lectures in this in this course. JC himself. So there has to be some connection there, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, And I'll give a quick answer and then pass it off to you. But it seems to me that there is deconstruction, loosely defined, happening in Tillich. Um, Even though it's a bit anachronistic to say that because he's writing before all the post-structuralist stuff is happening, but I think we can look back and kind of say something like deconstruction is going on. But for Tillich, it's embodied in what he calls the Protestant principle, which is the idea that no finite thing, no finite being can ever take the place of the infinite. And if we start to treat a finite being as such, we're engaged in idolatry. And he's thinking particularly of National Socialism in Germany and religious fundamentalism. Um, and so he's engaged in a very sort of quasi deconstructive project in that regard, I would say.
Mm-hmm. But I mean, I think for Tillich, the especially the way Caputo's reading them, it's his ontological structure that sets up for deconstruction. And Tillich's concept of the unconditioned functioned as the undeconstructible for Tillich. Now, Tillich, it kind of runs the other direction, I think, in the sense that um, you'll get in his early work uh, when he's still in Germany and first teaching theology, he uses the language of the break-in or the break-in structure or the rupture for the way in which the unconditioned um, seizes the conditioned. And uh, I have a couple quotes of his that I wrote down when I was like fascinated with the fact that he used this language and was interested in whether it was the same. But he said revelation must occur. It must happen. Without revelation, there is no concept of the unconditioned because there is no direct access, no point of contact with the unconditioned. When one encounters the unconditioned, it does not encounter it itself, but the unconditioned seizes both the moment of the conditioned object to the subject and the very subjectivity of the experiencing subject. So there,
That's really nice.
revelation is this breakthrough of the unconditioned into the conditioned world. And that makes it hidden, the unconditioned, because it doesn't show itself as the unconditioned. It's a rupture, an experience that requires a change of your self-conception. So it gives you a new self, and this is very Pauline in a sense for him.
Mm-hmm.
And there's one point in, I think it's in The New Being, but a sermon where he says that an encounter with the God whose mystery lingers beyond our mind, something like that, turns the world into creation. And so I think there's one of these connection points you see with Caputo, that this break-in structure, this encounter with the unconditioned, is a hermeneutical transformation, right? It gives you a new self, a new way of seeing yourself. It gives you the world becomes creation, because the world now is this like ever-present teeming possibility of the very place that the unconditioned breaks through. But like he's insistent that it's not the self, the conditioned self, that becomes aware of the unconditioned, but the unconditioned that makes it known to the subject. And that part is different, I think, than how deconstruction functions. For him, it necessitates a divine activity of the unconditioned. But he's getting that from Schelling there.
Mm-hmm.
And he also, for those that are like into German theology, he's there giving a robustly German idealist interpretation of Schleiermacher. Schleiermacher sees that the second person of the Trinity in a moment of revelation, that's the activity of the second person. And he talks about the third person as like this, like kind of ubiquitous presence of inspiration. Tillich wants the work of the second and third person to kind of function like a yo-yo, where it kind of like breaks through. And so he's like taking the notion, when he talks about it theologically, was where it like goes through the water, kind of like a yo-yo, and jerks out. So you get the revelation and inspiration. That if for Barth, the question of revelation is God has to both create the conditions for the possibility of revelation and bring the revelation itself. Right, like so Barth gives that story of like when Jesus puts the ear back on the guy, that Jesus like has to stitch the ear back on before he can be like, "You're my beloved," revelation. Tillich wants to say that in the act of creation, from this Ergrund, you're getting like out of Schelling, like in a world where the subject-object distinction's taken place, that is the conditions for the possibility of revelation. Because it is structurally all conditioned existence to the unconditioned. But he's agreeing with Tillich that it is the divine initiative of the unconditioned that makes God present. You're not going to ever point at conditioned reality and be like, oh, Jesus was the Christ, or whatever, like this is New Being. It always happens to you. It's an event. It's a rupture. So anyway, that's what popped him.
That's really nice. Yeah. Yeah, that's good. And I had never heard that spin on Tillich before. So I appreciate this whole group, because I'm learning just as much as y'all are. And I've really appreciated all the questions and comments in the group too, for the same reason. But yeah, that's really nice. So the second area from the Facebook comments and questions is kind of what's the relationship between good and evil in the ground of being, right? So if Tillich locates God in the ground of being, and the ground of being grounds good and evil, right? And if you know your Boehme and Schelling, like this ground of being is sort of at odds with itself and has a sort of antagonism within itself, right? If it gives forth a flux of forms that are both that we sort of see as both good and evil, right? If it's the condition for all these things, like why would the ground of being be worthy of worship, right? I mean, it's essentially the problem of evil just like recast into Tillichian terms.
Mm-hmm. And because
yeah,
I was only following up. I haven't read the other Jacob of in a while, but because he argues about there being a type of basic ambiguity in God, right? Like, so as the soul source, like whatever our experience necessitates labeling in good and bad, or we go being and non-being, or whatever, that those are identifications that take place in history But
Mhm.
because there's only one source, the ambiguity is internalized into the God before little b being.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And I think so. I think so. Two things. One, I think of the Jewish scriptures, for example, um, in I forget exactly the reference, but there's this idea of God as a all-consuming fire, right? Well, at the time, uh, there's this, if a structure catches on fire, the whole town is screwed, right? Like, and yet this becomes a metaphor they use for God, right? And to me, it seems that the kind of ambiguity that's going on in the ground of being um, isn't necessarily properly moral. It's actually like proto moral, or it's before morality. So it's not
Mm-hmm.
beyond good and evil, but it's sort of um, there's a very sort of vitalistic, almost very charged, kind of energetic view of the ground of being. It's sort of just giving forth excess, right? Um, so yeah, so all that to say, for me personally, and I haven't read the systematic theology as much as you have, Trip, so you can correct me after this, but my interest in Tillich, and I would say the interpretation I've gotten from Caputo, because he wants to emphasize this dark side of God in Burma and Schelling and Tillich. Um, to me, I'm not actually really interested in making Tillich orthodox on this point, because I think that's actually one of the things that's interesting about him. And I'm just sort of willing to bite the bullet and say, yeah, the ground of being is ambiguous here. And that's kind of, I don't know. It's interesting. And I don't really have a clear cut answer. Um, but it's something that Tillich brings to the table. So,
Well, in part of it is the tension between um, religious conceptions of God and the concept of being as a philosophical principle. And
mm-hmm.
Tillich explores it a bunch of different ways. But I can't remember what the article is, but where he's talking about it, and he says something along the lines of like, and he's presuming this as a German idealist, like that God can be established from existence is there, but we can't know who God is until the very end. And so, like how Schilling sees the movement of history from essay to the essence of God, uh, Tillich sees that process, or the ambiguity at the heart of uh, pre-subject object distinction existence is not a statement to define the character of God as ambiguous, but to define the nature of God's relationship to history as ambiguous, because the movement of history, or the coming of spirit and all that kind of stuff, it does involve a resolution of the nature of God's essence in history. It's kind of like from the
Mm-hmm.
event of creation, you have these distinctions. There is that ambiguity, and all of that that's entailed in it is part of what is being reconciled, worked out, and stuff in the process of history. And it's actually not, that move is not too far from what Karl Barth does in 3.3 in Church Dogmatics 3, Volume 3, where he has a whole reflection on uh, the nothing. And because what both of them are trying to get at in their kind of emphasis on the transcendence of God, the revelation of God, is to genuinely give God, preserve the ontological distinction between God and the world. And if God is the source of the world, then part of doing that is not letting God off the hook for the brokenness of the world or the ambiguity of the world and all that kind of stuff. But if God's nature, through the process of history, is to be something else, then how does God deal with the nothing? It's essentially a question that comes out of German idealism that has to be dealt with theologically. Um, um, and I just think a lot of times when we read something like that, we it's easy to move past it because most people, unless you're working real hard, and like everybody's idea of God is mostly folk religion. And then on occasion, there are bits of it in moments where you think through it philosophically and such. But like good and evil are one of those kind of binaries that you use for interpreting life religiously. But when you're making this big statement about like the unconditioned and things like that, there are consequences for it. So Tillich wanted to put it in. One of the other things about that that came to mind is, wouldn't it? And I think Caputo talked about it at some point in the thing about, isn't it Cassier or whatever, like about like mythological concepts of God and how God as religious traditions often experience God as person or anthropomorphic or whatever, and then you have like God as a principle when investigated from the philosophical side, and that tension has to end up getting explored. And when you're siding with the philosophical vision of God against the anthropomorphic one, the question of evil takes on it becomes a lot more robust of a question.
Mm-hmm.
Well,
yeah. Well, and I would say too, like, yeah, Tillich is a Lutheran who's grounded in German idealism, and German idealism is a philosophy that's grounded in Lutheranism, right?
Yeah.
And Luther, so Caputo talked about the Deus absconditus, right, which is the hidden God.
Yeah.
He mentions this in the lectures, and this is a concept I'm still trying to work through myself. This idea that God, there's something that escapes our conception of God that's beyond God, right? And this is coming out of Eckhart, God beyond God, right? So there's this whole German lineage happening here where Lutheran, well, first it's pietist theology, giving you Lutheranism, giving you German idealism, giving you Lutheranism again. You know what I mean? So all that to say is like I'm just throwing out some names if people want to like read further on in this lineage and sort of look at where it's coming from. So should we go on to number 3?
Yeah. And I was trying to see if the commentary on the side is connected to these questions. So Amart asked, so is the ground of being God necessarily a religious concept? One must be religious to be anything other than interesting. Well, I think Jake was just talking about it. I mean, he's getting it from German idealism, but I mean, I don't know how to, like, until relatively recently, there's very little philosophy that's not religious. And even if it's not religious, it's like taking religious things and making them not religious and calling it philosophy. And like that's like if you read even like Heidegger's early work, you can see basically the entire structure of being in time is based in his exegesis of First Thessalonians, and then he doesn't get a theology job, so he writes Being in Time and becomes a philosopher. And so like German idealism, yeah, but it's Germans thinking philosophically with Luther just ingrained in them, and so like part of what makes Tillich, so fruitful for radical theology is his reading of culture is a theological reading, which both makes it something you can use regardless of one's kind of theological situation, right? Like it can help you understand, interpret, engage, critique culture, but it also is doing so with the fire of a German notion of faith involved. But I don't know, what do you think?
I think I don't have anything to add to what you just said, man. That's good. I was looking at the chat down here too at the next one from Emery. Do you want to tackle that? I can read it.
Okay, because I'm just now looking at it.
Yeah. um, they want to know, how is ultimate concern religion? I can understand why Tillich sees ultimate concern as a fundamental impulse within religion, but it feels like he's making a massive leap to say that ultimate concern is religion. That's something that I can't seem to follow. So real quick, just to address that point, there is a distinction in Tillich between uh, the ultimate concern with the unconditional or the unconditioned, and then conditioned religions, right? And ultimate concern is the thing that kind of animates conditioned religion. So, like, my read or my interpretation is that he's pointing to an existential, excuse me, an existential impulse that animates everything to a degree. This is the theology of cultures to say that it's in art, religion, ethics, everything. And then particular religions are something that occurs in the ontic and in the realm of beings, and the specific and the particular, that are also animated by the same concern. Does that sound right to you, Trip?
Yeah, and I mean, the most basic thing what he means by ultimate concern is coming right out of the Luther's short catechism on what idolatry is. And so, I mean, this is something like Luther and Calvin were very clear on. Like, humans, like, main hobby is creating idols, right? So, and by making that observation, and you can even see it in culture, then, like, for when you move past the boundaries conceptually of Christendom, then you start to ask the question of faith differently. Like, what is it you give yourself to? And some people, do it authentically or inauthentically is a distinction that gets made by Tillich. Like, so sometimes you unconsciously, inauthentically, you're just performing what culture's given to you, and you have an allegiance, this ultimate concern driving towards prestige, possessions, power, all that kind of stuff. And when we have those, they end up being idols, or it could be, they're, obviously religious versions of the whole thing. So seeing religion as ultimate concern is really a kind of a existentialist interpretation of the nature of faith, and for Luther, that what it is that is most human has to do with how you give yourself deeply to something. So you are doing it. So either be aware of it or don't. I think you should be aware of it, and don't do it for crappy things. And, like, he thinks that the two biggest threats, Tillich, are how nationalism has become our true religion, and how the economy has. And in the economy part, he actually thinks that we're so invested in the economy because we think we'll get to a place that our own identity and our finitudes overcome by having security, be it like life insurance and a retirement fund and all that kind of stuff. And he's like, it's like when so much of our life is decided after we've done what's necessary to really protect us from the threat of non-being, then we do it. Then, your true faith is like getting over these things, and it's like idol worship. His is hilarious sermon. I think it's hilarious. It's not like funny, laugh, but where he's using a passage from 2nd Isaiah about how the Syrian Empire comes through or whatever, and now they were previously conquered by people that worship Nebu, but now Nebu has gotten strapped onto a horse, because they're just talking about, like, Nebu, the little statue, and they're going out of town until it goes like, if you give yourself something, if your ultimate concern is something, that when the tides of history or the economy change, it gets strapped on a goat as you're trying to escape desolation, then you've really put it in the wrong direction. And I would say, like, one of the things that Tillich points out is that there are, like, 3 different distinct meanings to the word faith in English. And this, I think he got so specific about it because he was coming from a context of doing German theology where it's different. But, like, in English, sometimes faith means to believe something. Like, I believe unicorns exist, even though there's no scientific proof for them, or something like that. And there's others where it's like, I have faith in you. And that's like, I trust you. I have confidence in you. I have faith in you, something you say to your partner covenantally, like, I'm going to show up for you, that kind of thing. And then there's, like, faith as fidelity. Like, will you keep faith with me? Like, will you be faithful to me? Can I expect fidelity from you? Are you trustworthy? Are you dependable and reliable? And like, if you look at all three of them, Paul's like, most of the time religious people think like faith is connected to belief in unicorns despite scientific evidence. And the reciprocal nature of faith is the second two. I have faith in you. Will you keep faith with me? And proper faith is one given to the one who will always keep faith. And so if the first definition is intellectual, since faith is a belief in something, and the second one is primarily affective. It's not intellectual. It's like faith is trust, confidence, assurance. It is a relational term, like I trust you. And the third one is more moral, like since it has to do with the moral character of someone who's reliable and trustworthy. It's relational in the other sense of like, I will show up, I'll be there. And so he's reinterpreting faith in this context through Luther, who defined faith as trust, as and underemphasizing its meaning as belief. So for Luther, faith's not intellectual sense; it's trusting God's promise to you that you're indeed God's beloved. And so when he is redefining faith as the state of being ultimately concerned, it is a double-sided concept. Its subjective side is that it indicates someone who is passionately concerned about something. It considers it to be ultimate significance, so like giving yourself to it, and it's like deeply sieged. And the objective side is it refers to that which one is concerned about and is going to show up for. And so like ultimate concern has not just to do with like, oh, I love you, blah, 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 but like, if you get sick, I'll wipe your butt, and so the ultimate has that like dual side for Tillich. And so the question that he's trying to raise in faith as ultimate concern is whether or not that which we're ultimate concerned about deserves it. Is it truly ultimate, or is it penultimate? And so it's a less of a, is it true faith or not, but is it a reciprocal one? And what is it that can give the reciprocity? Nation doesn't. The economy doesn't. So that was kind of how. Anyway, I don't know. To keep going, but that's how Tillich gets. And I think like his definition of it makes more sense if you just go if you read his sermons, then because he's wrestling with text, and you can see what it is he's trying to provoke in those that are listening.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's nice. The second part of Emery's question was basically saying, it's long, so I'll try to summarize it. It was basically saying Tillich's, well, first of all, Tillich's too Protestant, which fair enough, and and second of all, this locating the this sort of faith as an inward thing seems particularly Christian, and yet at the same time, Tillich's trying to universalize this faith structure. And so the worry is something like a sort of philosophical imperialism, right? Does that make sense?
Yeah. I mean, I guess kind of like, I don't know. I'm from the Free Church tradition, which is about as, it's like hyperbolic Protestantism. So
yeah.
like, but so I found the passage that is in the Catechism that Tillich's talking about from Luther, and Luther says, "A God is that to which we look for all good, and in which we find refuge in time of need. To have a God is nothing else than to trust and believe with Him, with our whole heart. As I've often said, the trust and faith of the heart alone make both God and an idol." So like the difference in God and idol is the direction of one's trust and faith. If your faith and trust are right, then your God is the true God. On the other hand, if your trust is false and wrong, then you have not the true God. For the two belong together, faith and God. That to which your heart clings and entrusts itself is, I say, truly your God. And and you underneath that, you can get a very Protestant reading of Augustine's Anthropology. Like true freedom is the freedom to love God, and so you will be religiously engaged because you will, like, human beings are exist as addressed species, and you have that longing, you have that desire, you have that openness of moving towards something, going towards something, and that kind of thing. So like what do you do with it? Is
It also seems to me, just for the second part of that question, it doesn't, like, Tillich speaks in very existentialist, phenomenological, German idealist kind of terms, right? Which tend toward the individual, I think. And Kierkegaard, the person I spend all my time reading, obviously does the same thing much more explicitly. But I don't think that the structures that they're getting at, or at least that Tillich's getting at, preclude something like a community being grasped by the ultimate, right? Which I think is the story of the covenant relationship between the people of Israel and God, right? So all that to say, I'd have to think a little bit harder about whether or not Tillich is a sort of Tillich's existential philosophical frameworks necessitate a sort of pietism. I think they're definitely emerging from that. I don't know if they necessitate that. So that's, for what it's worth, I just flagged that. The third question here is about the nature of the ontological philosophy of religion, and the Augustinian question of truth, right? So in the second essay in the Theology of Culture, which is one of my favorite pieces of theology, actually, the ontological philosophy of religion, Tillich basically says, you can't find God if you go searching for God out among beings, right? And what he's saying is that you're always already grasped and in the presence of God, because to presuppose the search for God is to search for God, or to ask the question of God, is to presuppose God. So there was a few comments that were asking, like, well, isn't that circular? How can you presuppose God before you've actually been able to posit God or demonstrate God or prove God? I mean, they weren't using those exact phrases, but that's kind of the dilemma. And when you're first reading the essay, that's one of the challenges. That's one of the sort of philosophical challenges of the essay, is that he's trying to get you to think like at a different level. So, or in a different dimension. So this is what in German idealist philosophy since Kant is basically called the transcendental deduction. And what that means is just you're trying to demonstrate the conditions for the possibility of any given phenomenon, right? So it's not that in searching for God, that presupposes the answer that you're looking for. It's that in searching for God, some higher structure must be at play always already in order for that search to take place. Okay, that's all really abstract and weird and difficult, but practically what that means is there has to be a structure of inquiry in order for inquiry to get off the ground. There has to be something to make inquiry possible, right? And so Augustine talks about it in terms of, I see an object, right? But that object is not the truth. The truth is the light by which I see, right? So then the light would be the condition for the possibility of being able to see an object, right? So that's actually like raised one dimension higher than the subject-object split, where I'm looking at that thing, right? So in other words, you could think of like, if I gave this answer in the chat somewhere. If you wrote like a 1 and a 0 on the page on a piece of paper, right? And we think about 1 and 0 as like the subject and the object, or as the person looking for the thing, right? The person looking for an answer. For Augustine and for Paul Tillich, God is primarily located not in any of the ink on the page. God is the page itself that makes possible writing or makes possible the ink. So in other words, God is always already presupposed in everything that we do just by the very nature of what it means to be God, right? And this also is interesting. So it's kind of like riffing. It's like a German riff on the ontological argument that Anselm gave that's drove philosophers insane for hundreds and hundreds of years, which is basically to say that God is kind of the precondition for all things and is greater than anything that can be thought, because anything that we think is an object, but God is the thing that makes objects possible, and God therefore necessarily exists, because if God didn't exist, no objects would be able to show themselves. So that's my very quick sort of like blitz through transcendental deductive logic. But
well, I think that's helpful because and at some point he makes it pretty clear about how he interprets Anselm's rule. Like, if God is that which nothing greater than can be conceived, Tillich is like, thank you, Anselm. I just wanted to be clear. That is not an actual description of God, but a rule for the possibility of speaking of God. Mm-hmm. Right? And so then when you talk about God, like it can't be anything less than that. Right. And then he wants to point out that the very nature of language necessitates ontologically the kind of like ontological pre-referent of language. And that's why he ends up like, when you use religious language is properly symbolic. And like the only non-symbolic thing he ever says about God is God is being itself. So, you know, there's this, that ontological, he has this book on, I forget what it's called, it's like the system of signs and the sciences or something like that.
Oh, yeah, I forget what it was called, but Caputo passed that around during his course at Villanova, and it was totally inscrutable. But yeah.
Yeah, but in it, he's like, you know, he's like talking about all the ways these different disciplines relate, and he's running basically Anselm's rule through the whole thing. You know, and that's awesome. and so he's not it's not like he says it just to set up for how it functions religiously, which is how it can get hurt if you're only thinking philosophy of religion. Mm-hmm. Like he in that bit, he has this whole thing on how, you know how Kuhn talks about these paradigm shifts in science and stuff. Right. Tillich's response is like, well, that's how you know that that science runs on mythology just as much as religion does.
But if you think about it, I mean, if you think about it, like if you do think that God is sort of the condition for all things, the condition for all beings, right? Or even if you want to cast it in more philosophical terms of the unconditioned or the ground of being, giving forth all possible beings, then every science has to have as their condition this infinite ground, right? Like, because everything has to have as their condition this infinite ground. And so like it makes sense that if you're trying to give a coherent theory of the integration of the sciences, that God has to show up, right?
Mm-hmm. One of the lines that I wrote in my notes after reading the book, so it's on page 273 of that book, but I don't know anything else other than I was very amused by this. He says, bad metaphysics seeks to establish the idea of God in positive, rational terms, irrefutably, of course. Kant should have explained to theologians that this is impossible, so they could move on to properly talking about God. Anyway,
it's good.
Which is, I actually think, like why his theory of religious symbols or symbols in general, right? Religious symbols are all symbols because they connect, they participate in the unconditioned. But he takes Augustine's understanding of the sacrament and then takes the ontological account of Augustine's notion of the sacrament and then makes that the ontological relation of God to all conditioned things, and the faith that makes things the faith that's present at the Eucharist is the faith that becomes present in the event of revelation. And anyway, and he modifies it. The modification he makes to Augustine's theory of signs and symbols is, it's based on Luther's modification of it. So like Luther, in his own kind of tension and stuff, like he gets to his big, insight when he realizes that when the priest says your sins are forgiven, priest isn't speaking as the priest or as the church, but on behalf of Christ. Mm-hmm. And so when those words come from God, then now your true condition as saint comes over this condition of you a sinner, but that paradoxical identity is the very paradoxical identity of the redeemed. Anyway, in October in the homebrew class, we're doing Tillich for the month, and we'll read more of him.
Nice.
In high school was when I first started reading Tillich.
That's crazy to me.
And I had no idea I didn't know what he's talking about. I just knew it sounded cool, because my dad gave me like Tillich and Kierkegaard books and Bonhoeffer. So I'm like, this is what intelligent Christians read. And I remember telling my friends at high school, like our theology reading group, which, there are only like 9 of us and like 4 of us have PhDs. So like they kind of understood what was going on. We just got into it and kept going. But I remember like telling one of them that was in the group, we were like at lunch and he prayed at lunch. And I got upset and I was like, you're using such anthropomorphic language for the ground of being. This is just idolatry. And since I've apologized, but man.
But I think that represents like a bad way that you could take Tillich, you know, like, and you definitely can take him that way, I think. But I think it's like really important to realize like that I think the reason that I haven't completely given up on Tillich, I think, is because I think that he's like pointing to a really profound affective and metaphysical like structure that undergirds a lot of the particularities of religious expressions.
Mm-hmm.
And I just think it's really important to remember that these symbols mediate the ultimate, and you can't just get the pure ultimate, right? Because that doesn't exist. There's no such thing, right?
Yeah.
I mean, it and that's the important thing about that's another part of the dialectical move happening in Tillich, is that you can never get the pure ultimate, the pure unconditioned, right? It's only by virtue of mediation through the conditioned forms that we can arrive at any sort of awareness of the unconditioned. If I didn't have an object to see, I wouldn't be able to become aware of the light that enables me to see, because it's through the act of seeing that I'm actually able to arrive at this insight, right? So,
and I think one of the reasons intellectuals have that, like you can have your critiques until, but then want to keep him around, is because in some sense he's like a super nerdy pastoral care for religious scholars, because he's sitting there and he's kind of like going, look, religion, we're aware religiously that no actual theological account or theoretical pointing to the ground of your theory or account can make the unconditioned alive within consciousness, right? Like you're studying stuff, but all that kind of thing never gets at the point. Right. For the theory of the unconditioned actually already has turned it into an object, and it's precisely not what it is. And so like he's kind of like sitting there gesturing at all the things you're doing to then remind you, like, when you're doing the thing you're doing, like until you're existentially engaged in the event, in the encounter and stuff, then it's actually, you're just like observing religion and or philosophy or that kind of thing. Like it's like outside of existential engagement, you are a spectator at what you're talking about. And when you're existentially engaged, it's precisely not an object of your reflection.
Right.
And like that thing is such a liberating experience. It's like the nerdy, it's like a ontology that tells the philosopher not to take themselves too seriously, in the same way like people write books on contemplative prayer, you know. Everything about their writing is a description of a place where the description itself seems kind of futile. But there's a whole point to cultivating it and having poetry that gets at it and learning practices to get there. But like whatever you're getting at when you're getting at it is not what you get at when you get at it.
Right.
And
Oh man, that's good. Whatever you're getting at when you get at it is not what you're getting at when you get at it. That's got to be a subheading in a paper for me someday. Okay, so the next one was there was a discussion of faith versus belief, and I think this was particularly more focused toward Caputo's usage of like faith versus belief in the deconstructive sense that he had been doing for years and years, and how that maps on to faith and belief in Tillich, because it seems like there's a similar something of a bifurcation there, right? Like ultimate concern being this deeper structure, right, underneath and undergirding particular belief. So I'm going to pass that to you, Trip.
well, I mean, we talked a little bit about it just like in how he said, but I would say like Tillich was pretty clear that he thought Protestants had not finished the Reformation. But he's getting that from Schleiermacher. Like the reason Schleiermacher has the Trinity at the end of his church, not church dogmatics, but the Christian faith, is because he didn't think the Reformation's not fully reformed doctrine yet. And faith is what the one that, if you're thinking of the doctrines that Tillich is on, is there. And he was convinced that inadequate ideas about God played the decisive role in creating the conditions of modern atheism. So like in his mind, a major part of his concern is clarifying what the term God means. It's almost like half the time what people use the word God for is folk religion, and it actually is properly responded to by faith in atheism. And then he's like, we haven't gone through that. So like God in Tillich's thought is not a being, it's not super being. You get like ground of being and all that kind of stuff. And so speaking of God in the fashion of subjects God to the subject-object split, which renders God finite. And he's like, just anytime that happens, and he likes to point out that it happens most with crappy theology and then crappy cultural critiques of religion. Like you can see that today. So underneath it, he begins by thinking about the nature of faith by looking at his ontological analysis of the human being, primarily the ontic shock of existence, those existential questions about how death, guilt, meaninglessness are all the variations about this threat of non-being. And so like angst is this how the finite person feels on the inside when they start to try to speak and grapple with this fear, which gets turned, it finds an object, but the object it finds, like I'm scared of snakes or I'm scared I'm gonna get hit by a car or whatever, it's latching onto those things. But behind it is this like conscious, ever-living awareness that you're being towards death. There's threat and non-being. Right. And idolatry for him, when you're thinking of faith, is the way in which your disposition to respond to the ultimate, it latches on to solutions that are less than the unconditioned itself. And when you latch, you've already committed idolatry, because the proper place of faith is not latched, but to be seized. And so idolatry is the attempt to overcome your anxiety about the threat of non-being by seeking refuge in some other finite thing, be it a person, be it a group, a force of nature, like, Hitler, the Aryan race, sex, whatever it is. But nothing finite can ultimately be the source of genuine courage to affirm one's life in the threat of death. And that's why he has that line that I like a lot, where he's like, a polytheism continues to fail. And like what he means by polytheism is like in our culture, we go from like thing to thing that we try to seize, this object over here to, like be our blanket in the face of non-being. And yeah, and so like when they're treated as deities, as finite deity, then it doesn't work. Biblical religion for him, or that like seeking the courage to be, is the infinite power of the God of being conquering non-being. And what happens for religious people is they read these biblical texts about these histories and encounters with this deep, rich, ultimately unspeakable power. And then they're like, well, the particular language and reference that the people that are encountering this thing use, that's the God. And then so you have like idolatry fueled by biblical language and stuff.
Well, and this to me, and this is what motivated my initial question. I think it was in the first session with Jack about asking if Tillich is a mystic, right? Mm-hmm. And Jack very clearly said no. But this is where my hunch comes from, is that the relation to God in Tillich is something that has to necessarily be beyond words, beyond and beyond expression, right? Mm-hmm. Because to speak is to give something a finite and definite expression, but to be united to God in faith is something that exceeds that, the power of language, right? Which is something that we find very much in a lot of mystical texts in at least in the Christian tradition. And so, yeah, I do think that there is I'll say to use Jack's turn of phrase, I do think there's a mystical element in Tillich's thought, right?
Yeah.
That I find solid. And again, this line, right? So if we wanted to trace a historical line, we would look at Eckhart, we would look at Tauler, we would look at the German, I forget the Latin name, but it's The German Theology is this book of devotional writings. We would look at how that was mediated through Luther, and Tillich is drawing on all of those sources that I think are really animating this particular stream, this particular theological lineage. Our last question from the Facebook comments, which this is your home turf here, Trip, is a question about the relationship or the resonances between Tillich's thought and process thought, and whether or not we can think about quantum physics with Tillich. And I actually have a really funny story from class, from a lecture that Caputo gave on this, where he was thinking about Catherine Keller and he was thinking about quantum physics, and he drew this picture of the ground of being, in a way that it's like this it's like this cone, and here's the ground of being giving forth finite beings, and this is kind of where we live up here, but there's this ground that's constantly giving forward things. And he was making the distinction, the sort of analogy between a sort of a quantum field and then the collapse of the particle wave duality, right? And saying, yeah, there's like, just in the way that quantum physics works, where there's possibility, there's pure possibility until the particle wave duality gets collapsed, right? There is some too muchness of the possibility of all possibilities, which is God, right? In a way that, whoa, oh, you're sharing stuff with me. Okay. In a way that, in a way that's very similar to how some scientists conceive of quantum physics. So all that to say, at least Caputo does see a parallel between Tillich and quantum physics, but I'll let you handle the process side.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think there's enough interpretations of quantum physics that you can find one for every school of thought.
I wasn't going to say that, but yeah.
There's a number of them that are super process friendly.
Copenhagen School for the win, right?
well, also like David Bohm was a
Hmm.
Whiteheadian, and he has a different theory. Whitehead has his own. Um, uh, Carlo Rovelli um, is very similar. Anyway, the I think the two biggest, like, if you were interested in like their most explicit connections, it's in volume 3 of his systematic and his understanding of the spirit. And what's the funniest part about it is he really, um, I some people told me they think it's because he just had almost no interest in British or American philosophy, but he's very insistent that what he's saying is different than what Charles Hartshorne is saying at that time.
Hmm.
If you read it, like if you read his Doctrine of the Spirit, the distinctions he's making, I don't know if I would make. And if you didn't tell me which side he took and were like, which one sounds most processed, I'd probably pick Tillich's answers each time. So there are certain similarities, especially by the time he gets there, which the later in his life, he kind of started engaging more in relational ontologies, and there are individuals who do a lot of work connecting Tillich and Whitehead. So John Tatominal, like at Union Theological Seminary, he he basically uses Tillich's ontological structure and Whitehead's metaphysical account of becoming. And in Whitehead, what's called creativity correlates to the unconditioned in Tillich, and then after that, it all kind of works like a process interpretation of German idealism.
Yeah.
Then there are people at the Boston School like Robert Neville, Wesley Wildman, those types that lean much more Tillichian, but use process categories for engaging more explicitly kind of religious and science conversations. Robert Neville has a whole basically ground of being process account. And like if you were wanting to make those connections, like he's definitely the person I would go
and I think
check out.
Oh, sorry. I think just to get like super explicitly nerdy for a second, like if you're looking at this in terms of the history of philosophy, somebody like Alfred North Whitehead is explicitly trying to circumvent German idealism, trying to get back behind Kant and say, actually, the empiricists are where we want to be. We want to take Hume to places that he wouldn't go, right? Which, if you think about it,
Hume assumes like your access to the world is only through your senses,
right?
And so you are a closed material substantive box that connects to the world through your senses. Whitehead has this notion of prehension and thinks, thank you, physics. There are no like solid substances that are boxes. So he gets rid of, because of science and the stuff that kind of got brought up in the question, he gets rid of Newton's kind of mechanism. He gets rid of Hume's sensationalism, how you interact and relate to the world, and then which ends up undoing Descartes' dualism, which for much of modern thought, like once the world was related to as things functioning on laws and mechanistic ways, and they're little billiard balls of matter that bump and follow rules, then you ask yourself, like, well, where does consciousness come from? Where does spirit come from? Do we have souls and all that kind of stuff? And Descartes' like, yeah, that's why you have a pineal gland. That's where the mind comes in. It gets put in here, and there's like a ghost in the machine. But don't worry, like the rest of life doesn't have that, like humans do, because you're made in the image of God. So, like, if you're slowly drowning a puppy and it's whimpering and searching for air, it looks like it has feelings and stuff, but it doesn't really, because it's just, it's just matter and motion.
I'm sad now.
And so what Whitehead is like, as an empiricist, he's a radical empiricist. And so then he goes like, literally the most obvious thing to your existence is something Descartes points out, namely that you're a conscious thinking first person self that has an experience of the world. Now, if you aren't going to use the dualist escape hatch and like sneak it in to nature at the very end of the thing, then there must be something, if you're giving an actual rational, thoughtful, scientific account of the world, that emerges into first person intention like experiences that we have.
Mm-hmm.
If you can't say that matter eventually just like births a mind baby, then whatever our experience of mind must be something that is evolving and becoming more complex over time, just like the quantum fluctuation in a vacuum did cosmologically. And so like when you get rid of Newton's mechanistic determinism, you have like a philosophy of organism. You get rid of sensationalism, you have prehension, the way in which you're entirely subjective, constitutively tied to all things in this relational flux of the world. And then you get rid of dualism, and you have a type of pan-experientialism, where there's always an inside and outside of all entities. You, as a radical empiricist, don't just think through the world based on your experience as third-person stuff as objects. You also have to give the dignity to all things that you give to yourself, namely your first-person experience, your subjectivity. And so then you get rid of Descartes' dualism and get a type of pan-experientialism. Now it's not good to choke puppies in water. So if you hate slowly suffocating puppies, go process.
So, but here's the thing, that whole lineage, right, that Whitehead is drawing on is explicitly leaping behind Kant and saying German idealism, that's a road that I just don't care to deal with, right? Kant, Fichte, Schelling, Hegel, not forming the essential vocabulary and main contours of thinking for Whitehead, even though the payoff is very similar in a lot of ways. But you're not going to get a transcendental deduction, like I said earlier, like what I was explaining. You're not going to get that. You're not going to get that kind of move in Whitehead in those exact same terms, right? Whereas for Tillich, that's his bread and butter. That's what he wants to do. He wants to deduce transcendental conditions for the possibility of phenomena, because he's essentially responding to Kant just like everybody else is in the German idealist tradition. And so to me, and this is what is interesting, like in process and in German idealism, or in process in continental thought writ large, which is coming out of a very similar trajectory. You're getting a lot of the same payoff, but they're not talking to each other in the same way. They're not using the same language. So all that to say, I agree with you. I think Tillich's system is extremely amenable to the same insights as process and vice versa. It's just been a problem of translation.
And I would also say, like, the Schelling and Hegel are a lot closer to Whitehead than Kant is. Like,
right.
He had a much more, his epistemological protection. He's epistemological protectionist. His first two critiques create a very strong barrier for doing metaphysical reflection.
Yeah, but the third one, man, that's where it all happens.
Oh, I know, but you can make him cooperate with Whitehead a lot more.
Yeah,
in the third reduction.
Yeah.
But I mean, the other thing I was going to say is, but that reading, or trying to, put vitality back in the world on the terms of Kantian stage, I think part of a process thought is like, yeah, but that's not necessary anymore, because that's not even how we understand the world to be working, right? And so, like Kant had, anyway, we don't have to go into this, not necessarily about Paul Tillich, but just to say that sometimes something that seems necessitated by the best account of a world at a given time, as you come to understand more about the universe scientifically, it invites us to rethink through our epistemology. And so certain features of existence that are hard to fit in under one philosophical system are easier. But then, like Tillich, bigger pushback, I think, to a process thought would be about anthropology. Like, he's like, hey, you give us consciousness, but now, like, what is a human anyway? Like a ongoing society of like that's, I'm just trying to think like I would push back that way if I was operating as a Tillichian. Anyway.
That's good. So that's it for the Facebook questions. Do you have some from the email?
Well, I mean, we've kind of talked about everything. The only other thing that came up in it that someone asked, he was talking about breakthrough structure, blah, 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 blah. But it was about the difference, because I'd mentioned how he and Bart early on have a lot more in common than later. And one of the ways I've kind of differentiated the two of them is, and it came up when they were teaching systematic at the same time, and there were people in both their classes, and they're like comparing what young Bart and young Tillich are saying to each other. Mm. And Tillich would hear what was said and then like want to draw a contrast, like to make sure he doesn't get taken as a sidekick of Bart kind of thing. Mm-hmm. But Tillich, so Bart preserves the filioque clause, in the Trinity, the very Western Trinity. So like the Father there, and then the Son proceeds from the Father, and the Spirit proceeds from the Father and the Son, right? And so any event of revelation is an event of Father, Son, Holy Spirit. Tillich, if you're describing his ontology in Trinitarian terms, prefers the Eastern Trinity, where he wants to rid the Spirit of its dependence on the Son. He wants God being potentially present in all of creation, and not limited to the specificity of the Son. So for the Christian, the event of revelation, the encounter, or whatever way you want to talk about it, in Christ is normative in content, right, for recognizing the presence of God elsewhere or whatever. And it demonstrates the shape of genuine religious encounter that produces faith. But it's not as if the Son is has a monopoly on the presence and activity of God via the Spirit. And so, like, if you think like Western, there's like this line that every event is a Christological one because the Spirit proceeds from the Father and the Son. Tillich's more like, Father, you got the Son here. And we're like, oh yeah, new being in Christ. Thank you, symbols. This is great. And then the Spirit's over here. Because if you flip it upside down, you think of like the unconditioned, conditioned existence. Our faith is this rupture that happens when we identify Jesus as the Word of God, that kind of thing. But that structure, we realize through the work of the Spirit, is always already ontologically possible for all things. I always find that that distinction between the two, you can see how they have certain things they hold in common together, but also it makes so much more sense of what he's doing in this third volume of the Systematic, where he says stuff that sounds a lot like Bergson and stuff like that, where there's like vitalism and the presence of the Spirit and all that kind of thing. It's not that he's like deflating his Christology that he's developing in the previous one. It's that the Christology itself is giving you under the conditions of faith, is giving you kind of the place in which to recognize the vitality of the life of the Spirit, because the Spirit is not dependent on the Son. So
I guess the last thing that we should probably address is a question from the chat from Anthony, who asks, basically the gist of his why on Tillich's account, why should we still go to church? Is there a reason for participating in the liturgical community and Tillichian thought? And so this is an interesting trip. I think me and you have different histories with Tillich. So for me, my reading of Tillich is extremely influenced by the Death of God and by Caputo's own sort of mediation of Tillich. I first read Tillich with Caputo. And you have obviously much more command of the explicitly theological aspect of Tillich. You're a good pastor, I'll put it that way. You're a good pastor, and you do good Christian theology, and I'm over here in a theology department trying my best to do philosophy of religion. And you've read the systematic theology too, which gives you an advantage over me here. but I will just say, so all that to say, my interpretation of Tillich has been one that has been tied up with the secularity thesis as well. You know what I mean? So in other words, Tillich was seen as kind of like a way to preserve the religious even when institutions sort of fade away or something like that. Now, I think that's a possible way to take Tillich, and I think that's the way Jack wants to take Tillich, but I don't think that's the way you have to take Tillich, and I don't think that's the way Tillich understood himself, right? I think that's a latent possibility in Tillich's own work. All that to say, you don't get ultimate concern without mediation in finite forms, right? So at the very least, on a Tillichian account, the reason you would continue to participate in a liturgical community is because that symbol set you have been grasped by the ultimate through those symbols, right? And you don't get to choose when or how you get grasped, right?
Mm-hmm.
So there's a sense in which there's a sense in which, right, like I said, without finite the mediation of finite institutions, one doesn't actually this grasping of the ultimate is not possible. But I want to hear your.
I just think that a couple things to point out. Like one, some of the reasons people would think a community like the church or any historic wisdom tradition isn't necessary is because of that the decoupling of Christ from the Spirit and that form, I think means that there's you don't have a justification of the church as like the ark of salvation or whatever, right? Like the only place you get it. But underneath his theology of culture is precisely a critique of the non-religious culture as ultimately subservient to political and economic powers that are more destructive of the human understanding of the self and more invested in cultivating your anxiety. Just think of the way the anxiety gets marketed to in capitalism, all that kind of stuff. Like, I feel like also, the things he most famous for outside are his sermons and the 2 books he wrote for normal people. And if you just read them, they are books that you would use at a church book group,
right.
And they were, and that's why they were bestsellers. And his big philosophical insights he has in his life come from being a World War I chaplain on the front lines. So, if you read his biography, it makes sense that, and he also defined a theologian as a vocation of the church. But he said a theologian is a churchman on the boundary. And so he has like a dual allegiance. But I would say in his discussion of symbols, he says symbols are not created ad hoc, right? Like,
right.
If you want to and if you are outside, let's say the mythopoetic community of a symbol, like, you can walk by a cross and get nothing out of it and think, well, it's really weird that there's a lot of these in this context, or it means something to you. And so the context for a lot of conditioned existence ever being organized, presented in such a way that it it becomes the very content that seizes you, happens because you're part of a religious tradition. And in his sermons and in his lectures, you hear him reflect on how powerful he thinks the natural movement through the liturgical practices are each week. Like the beginning worship and the call to worship is that we are trying to align ourselves with creation's relationship to the ultimate concern. Gratitude, welcoming, awakening to the presence of God. Confession is putting before us our own finitude, our own desires, how our own anxieties hurt other people to our own gain, deny, repress the issues that we're carrying with us, and that should you come into a place to hear the stories of God, so that they seize you and transform you, you have to come in aware of your own brokenness. But the confession of one brokenness is the occasion to speak the word of grace upon you, right? Like, and you could, like, everything about the liturgical cycle for him coheres to his like larger picture. Um, and and so for him, I think the question would be, is your participation in the church something that, or is the way you're relating to it one where you realize, and take an ownership of what it is you're doing, or is the participation something you're doing flatly, and it's the means by which you never learn to take your own existence seriously? But if you look at the content of it, like, if you're going to go to one Sunday morning liturgy, don't tell me the commercials between, like the football game are going to do a better job at putting you in touch with your own brokenness and desire to, to like seize your own existence than liturgy done well.
Mm-hmm.
And the other thing I would say is Tillich was very clear that and this comes out of his like, connection to critique of culture and stuff like the worship, the activity of worship is valuable all on its own. And one of his problems with American religion was that everyone had to make it all practical. Like, conservatives, like, oh, I got to take something home and make it practical. Right, and then liberal Protestants, he thought, had to turn it into a good reason to be a Democrat or to be an activist or whatever. And he is Lutheran enough to find that third use of the law problematic. And he thinks that you don't work to justice because you have to. The most powerful movement towards justice is because you get to. And it is a response outside of a subject who's been given greater dignity, value, and, because the transformation of the self enables this movement externally. So Lutherans, the proclamation of the gospel is the most powerful act for transformation. And you can see that in the sermons, right? Like, unlike if you think of like Niebuhr's sermons, they're both at Union at the same time. Tillich's sermons are about receiving the fullness of your dignity and your identity in Christ, so that you can go in the world without anxiety and engage in transformation. Niebuhr's are like very much more reformed. You'll get policy in it. Yeah. You'll get anyway. So,
well, I mean, I think, and I love. I was just gonna say, I love that vision of the relationship between worship and politics in Tillich. That's closely aligns with like how I feel healthiest when I view things that way. So,
all righty, well, that's fun.
Yeah, that was. How did we do? Oh,
I think we did more than good.
We did it. We finished. Week 1 is in the books. Way to go, guys.
All right.
Next week,
I'm going to go talk about Logos Christologies in 20 minutes.
All right, cool, man.
All right.
Have a good talk, and I'll see you all around the group.
Yeah, and message me when you're coming through North Carolina.
Okay. I'll shoot you a text after this.
All right. Peace.